Good afternoon. Welcome to Policy Exchange. My name's Dean Godson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange, and my pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished keynote event here today. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome back Right Honourable John Healey, MP, now newly minted Secretary of State for Defence, here to Policy Exchange, following his very consequential keynote address at Policy Exchange in opposition earlier this year, which I urge all of you to look at. Indeed, though I'm not a particular believer in nominative determinism, it does seem to me that every consequential Labour Defence Secretary has the surname of Healey, so we're particularly... That's no disrespect to the Right Honourable Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, who is, of course, doing the review as a most distinguished other former Secretary of State, who, of course, shares the surname with the other Lord Robertson, who was, of course, British head of the Allied Control Commission in Germany after World War II, and worked so successfully with another one of our guest of honours heroes, Ernest Bevin, in the early stages of the Cold War. Also, a particular pleasure to be able to welcome Mark Urban, one of Britain's leading broadcasters, authors on all of these matters, and they will be having an in-conversation. We'll then have question and answer from the floor. Usual house rules here at Policy Exchange, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. And also, before introducing them all and turning the floor over to them, just to say a particular word of thanks to our sponsors, Boeing, for their generosity in coming in here today, to Maria Lane, President of Boeing Europe, and all the more important in the light of this government's commitment to an understanding of defence industrial strategy. So, John and Mark, over to you. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
John, you wanted to kick off with a couple of remarks.
Okay, thank you. Dean, first of all, thank you for hosting me and us again. You're encouraging people here to read the speech I gave at Policy Exchange. I had to do that when I went through the doors of the MOD after the election. And when they came to me with their plan for defence reform, I had to get them to read it again, just to, because they didn't get it. But that's a framework for what we have no choice but to do in British defence, because we do not reform, and if we do not reform in that way, we're simply not going to be in a position to deal with the decisions that will come from the Strategic Defence Review. We will not be in a position to deal with the financial pressures that are a treadmill for defence, and we will not be able to deal with resetting the sort of relationship that's required between government and industry for the future in order to deal with the threats, the increasing threats we're facing. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you, Mark, for hosting and holding this conversation. This is our second time lucky, isn't it? We were going to do exactly this conversation at the London Defence Conference on the very afternoon that Rishi Sunak called that unexpected election. So,
auspicious.
I'm glad Keir Starmer hasn't thought of doing the same this time. Mark, I can't pass this up. I just, and I think everyone would echo this, we have huge respect for your career, particularly as diplomatic editor of Newsnight. We miss you on that programme. We all understand budget cuts. I'm not sure any of us really understand the format changes. Let's move on.
Well, thank you, John.
And on Ukraine. So what next for Ukraine, which is our title and theme here. What next for Ukraine, in many ways, is going to be defined for us all if President Zelensky delivers on what he's trailed as his promise to turn up in New York with his victory plan. Why is that important? It isn't just important because the Ukrainians are the ones who are fighting, the Ukrainians are the ones who have the right to call a stop, and our task is to support them in their fight and then to support them at any point when they decide they may want to stop. But it's important for this, and it is something that I have urged on President Zelensky, as others have, and on his defence minister in the 7 times, I think, that he and I have met in the last 2 months since I got this job, and before. But if we, Ukraine's close allies, have a better idea about their plan, then we're in a better position for us to be able to plan how we can support not just the immediate provision of help, but the long-term production. Not just the immediate sort of training of their troops, which we will do, but how do we equip them for the future to be a force that can protect themselves in the future. So I see this meeting in the United Nations and the potential contribution that President Zelensky is promising as defining for this next period ahead.
So picking right up from that point and your remarks this morning in your speech to conference about as long as it takes and until they win, does the UK government have a conception of what victory is? What does victory for Ukraine look like?
Victory for Ukraine is defined in the terms for them, but it is absolutely preventing Putin from prevailing. And I think the focus for us, and it has been over the 2 months or so since the election, has been twofold. First of all, making sure that we not only continue the staunch UK support for Ukraine, but step that up, and we've done that in a number of ways. But second, to recognise that we need to do more than simply provide the military support, and that we are announcing today the setting up of a joint Foreign Office and MOD unit, specialist unit on Ukraine. It's partly a reflection of the joint work that David Lammy and I have done in and on Ukraine and jointly in the 2 departments. But its importance is that it signals for a UK government, and it's more widely what we need to do, is military, economic, industrial, diplomatic. Ukraine needs our support on a number of fronts, and we've not been doing that.
Does UK have a point of view about they've got to get the East back, or they've got to get Crimea back, or they've got to get all their occupied lands back, or is that entirely up to the Ukrainians in your view?
Well, immediate battlefields positions suggest two points of pressure and priority, although fundamentally in the end these calls are for the Ukrainians and not for us. So first of all, I'm very concerned about the continuing pressure the Russians are exerting in the east, particularly around Petrovsk, where the Russians are now within a few kilometers of that town, which the Ukrainians don't want and really can't afford to lose. The second is the Kursk incursion, which I think was a really sharp reminder for us all that the Ukrainians still have the capacity to spring battlefield surprises. They still have the capacity to put Putin on the back foot. And its significance and the need for Ukraine to be able to hold that land for now is that it puts Putin under pressure. It brings home to Russia the consequences of Putin's invasion in Ukraine in a way that otherwise is much more controllable for Putin. So Kursk is an open wound for Putin, and part of the task, I think, for the UK and for other allies is to help Ukraine with its moves and its plan to hold that for as long as it decides it needs to.
I mean, it's part of this plan for victory, isn't it, that Zelensky's talked about. Another part of that is deep strikes into Russia using these Ukrainian-developed drones. We've seen these huge ammunition blasts in the past week. We've seen very successful attacks on airfields. Where does Storm Shadow fit in to that sort of plan of deep strikes? How important is it? And do you think you and the Americans have actually now got an understanding on it?
I take quite a simple view of this debate about specific weapons, which is that the more that we do that, the more that we play into Putin's hands. I think Putin is the only one who benefits from that sort of debate.
But public difference with the US, you mean? Or
No, a public debate about
Targeting or
specific targeting, specific weaponry, and specific permissions. In general, we've donated weapons to Ukraine for their defence, and as long as those are used within the bounds of international law, and for self-defence, that does not, in general, preclude strikes on Russia. But in terms of the in terms of the longer range, part of the significance of Kursk on the battlefield is it helps better protect its northern cities and its northern power stations. But it also allows it to strike some of the Russian command centres, the sort of ammunition dumps that otherwise would be out of range. And Ukraine is doing that with a range of weapons. We've seen, as you say, the long-range drones that have hit ammunition dumps, massive ammunition centres in recent days. And this is a way of Ukraine defending itself, but also putting Putin under pressure.
one of the things that's come up throughout this past 2.5 years is a sort of cyclical argument about certain categories of weapons. And then sometimes what we hear, doing my sort of job, is people in the services saying, well, we may not have that many of these, and so you shouldn't expect too dramatic an effect. And I have heard that about Storm Shadow, and I've also been looking at the fact the US has been unable to actually do its drawdown on about $6 billion worth of weapons because of a Pentagon feeling that we're now getting to the point where we really don't want to send more of this or that category. How big a problem is that, the fact that the West's own stocks are right at the limit?
Well, it quite clearly is, isn't it? Because what Ukraine has forced us to recognise afresh is that when a country is under threat or forced to fight, your forces are only as strong as the industry that stands behind. And we've had the luxury in recent decades in the West and in the UK of essentially failing to recognise and act on that lesson, no longer. So I suppose one of my points about this singular question of Storm Shadow is it misses the range of really vital weaponry and systems that Ukraine is needing, we and other countries are providing. So when I went to Ukraine on the second day in this job, and I'm a bit of a Ukraine regular now because that was my third visit, I spent the afternoon with President Zelensky. We together visited injured soldiers, which I spoke about this morning in the conference hall. But we had some detailed bilaterals. And just as they did again in Ramstein, they wanted artillery, they wanted Soviet-style ammunition, and they wanted air defences. And so across that range, we've been providing them, and we've started to produce them as well. So one of the things that we've done since July the 5th is to let the contract for £300 million worth of new Soviet-style ammunition, and that will start to be delivered into Ukraine before Christmas. And the other is to put in place fresh contract, new production of short-range modern air defence missiles, LMMs, and they again will be delivered into Ukraine. They will start to be delivered into Ukraine before Christmas. So this is about stepping up what we can do, and it's also about speeding up what we said we'll do. And it's across the range, Mark, which is why seeing what Ukraine needs in the broader, rather than the specific points of debate that we've had in recent weeks, I think will help us do more to support Ukraine in the ways that they need.
I was talking to an officer who is working, a British officer working closely with the Ukrainians, and he said to me, they can come up with fixes on problems with weapons, whether it's a drone or something that goes on an aircraft, in 6 weeks. We have trouble doing it in 6 years. I mean, what does what you've seen there tell you about the scale of challenge in terms of our own management of defence, what has to be done?
Well, the first thing it tells us is that if you are fighting for your freedom and you're at war, then it isn't just that you can do that, you have to do that. And having visited a big drone factory in the outskirts of Kyiv, when I visited actually a week before Rishi Sunak called the election, they were telling us there that essentially the life cycle of the drones they were developing there was about 6 to 8 weeks. In other words, they'd develop them, they'd make them, they'd put them into the battlefield, and within 6 to 8 weeks, the Russians had found some way of jamming them, stopping them, bringing them down, so they had to reinvent them. Now, there are a number of you here, either in the British defence industry or very close to it. I mean, that type of cycle of invention, design, production, delivery, reinvention is just unthinkable. But it can't remain unthinkable for us because we may be, for a start, we're faced with supporting Ukraine. So we have to be able to work with them on those sorts of timescales. And so the drone link-up that we've been doing is partly a discipline for us and a support for them. But fundamentally, it tells us that if we start with a view about the sort of war we may need to fight in the future, then we need a very different way of making strategic decisions as a country, with allies, and we have a very different need for a relationship with industry and a procurement process. So we're doubling back really to where we started with this concept of reform and the speech I gave to Policy Exchange before at Dean's invitation, because this may be something that for a politician is the very last thing most politicians want to do. There aren't photo opportunities, there's no political bonus points, but fundamentally, if I don't make this one of my first strategic priorities, which I have, then I will be failing in everything else that I set out to do.
The reform agenda, which you set out at Policy Exchange in February, which I advise people to go back to the website and have a look at what you said. Look, you've now been in there for a few months and you had that agenda that you set out, and you've now seen the real state of British defence. Is there anything you'd like to tell us before you get seriously into this review process about the scale of challenge that lies ahead?
It's worse than we thought. So the state of the finances is worse than we thought, the state of the forces is worse than we thought, the state of the internal capability is worse than we thought, and some of that will become apparent in the Strategic Defence Review. But we can't wait for the conclusions of that, which is why on a number of fronts you'll see me acting and taking decisions now.
Timescale for the review?
We said we'll do it within a year at the election. I've said that when the Prime Minister commissioned it, we said we'd do it for the first half of next year, and I want that to be the early part of the first half of next year.
How is it Lord Darzi can do the NHS, an enormous and complex thing, in the time he took, and you can't do this faster?
Two reasons. First of all, Lord Darzi's done it before. Second, the NHS is certainly big, but it's by no means as complex as defence. And I suppose I'd add a third, that most of what anyone needs to take a hard strategic view of the NHS is out in the public. The data, the experts, the debates are all out in public. That's not the case in defence and security, and it cannot be. And so it is inherently more complex, and therefore it will take a bit longer.
And that reform agenda, I mean, just picking up a few points, the creation of a military strategic HQ in the MOD, appointment of a national armaments director, those types of things, is that all forging ahead at a speed you'd like, your defence reform agenda, or do you already feel the forces of, what some people would call the blob or vested interests already slowing that down?
No, it is now. and there is inevitably a period where communicating and clarifying what I mean, what I want, why I believe we need it is required. That's clear now. And it isn't just setting up essentially a troika, a revamped role for the permanent secretary, a reinforced role for the chief of the defence staff, a renewed definition of what a national armaments director in the UK must do. The reason for doing that isn't because I want three authoritative posts to work alongside me and the ministerial team. It is because the one question that Defence finds hard to answer is who's responsible for this, who has the authority to make the decision on this, and who is accountable for whether or not this works or doesn't work, is done or is not done. And there's a few nodding heads. I think you'd accept if you've got any organisation and you've got any strategic sort of plan or imperative, if you haven't got that clear, then your chances of being able to make the decisions, get the implementation, improve and evolve in how you do it as you go, is inevitably compromised and hobbled.
You're making it sound like the BBC, John. But look, I'm going to ask you.
Well, I think if George Robertson or Lord Darcy did a review of the BBC, it would take them years.
I'm going to ask one quick question, and then we will throw it open to some from the floor. In that process that you've just described of trying to get a grip of it all, how important is it that you have a definite sign and that we in the broader public have a definite sign from the Treasury about the road to 2.5%? Is that a necessary waypoint on your way into this review process?
Look, it is necessary. It isn't, actually. And it will happen. And I can say that because there is a unique commitment in the Labour manifesto that we will set a path and we will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. Despite the 5 missions or any other area, you will not find another spending commitment like that in the manifesto. That's number one. Number two, the Strategic Defence Review has the guide rails of that within which it's working. So, 3, this links to the reform. Actually, it doesn't matter whether John Healey is in there doing this. For those involved in defence, I'm going to stick around. I'm planned to be around, and we now at least have a government which promises a stable 4 to 5 years because the public have given us a strong mandate and a large majority. But in the end, you will not find any other manifesto commitments to reform or mechanics in government like we have on defence for any other realm, and you will not find a spending commitment like we have for defence in any other departmental area.
I think you were the first to catch my eye. Yep, let's take some questions quickly.
You mean shorter answers?
Well, if we can squeeze another few minutes out of you, that might also help.
Thank you very much. Philippe Lefebvre, Centre for Britain and Europe. A lot of the more advanced weapon transfers are being hindered by a lack of trust and training, really, from the West to Ukraine at the moment. And with this in mind, lack of trust and training at a much higher level than we've already given. And with that in mind, I want to ask the Minister, at what point will Britain deploy troops into Ukraine to be able to provide support to the critical infrastructure and to the cities and allow Ukraine to really put more energy in defeating Russia as quickly as possible? Thank you.
on putting troops into Ukraine to train, it's our view at the moment, and those of the allies that are involved in the programs like Interflex, the 11 other allies, that actually the most effective way of doing this isn't necessarily, all other things set aside, to be in Ukraine doing it. There's a lot that can be done very close to Ukraine, and that the biggest constraint at the moment is Ukraine providing the personnel in order to be trained. The second question is the sort of training beyond the basic survival and soldiering that Ukraine needs. And that doubles back to where I started, which is, what's the plan? What's the plan that Zelensky has that will set out a path for victory, that is a framework within which countries like us, especially us, are capable of then adjusting our plan and gearing our capacity to support them and provide that. So I don't see that as the central question, I have to say. The question is, what do they most need, how does it fit in, and how can we best do that, rather than in their country or out.
I noted your point about them providing the people there, John. Next question.
Thank you so much. Great panel, well, great conversation. My question is on Europe.
What's your name?
Carolina Saludes. Thank you. I asked your colleague Luke Pollard this morning about how you're how you're planning to engage with von der Leyen and her new team in Europe. We've got a new they have a new defense commissioner, a new HP, so a new high representative for foreign policy. Let's make it quantitative. What is one key thing that you want to get out of this new relationship, say over the next year when it comes to Ukraine? What is one thing that you want this new collaborative approach to come out as when it comes to Ukraine?
It's an appreciation that Britain is now led by a party that is pro-European, an appreciation that we see as many other European countries, and we expect the European Commission and Union as an institution to do, to recognise that we have common shared interests in the security field, that it makes sense to cooperate more closely together, and ultimately if we can reach an agreement or some sort of formal pact, then we will. But in the meantime, I'm determined that we demonstrate that serious intent. We look for closer cooperation, as well as a process that when the new Commission and the European Union institutions are up and running again, probably late this year or early next year, we get into those discussions. But that doesn't stop us looking for areas of cooperation in practice, in the meantime, in advance.
Sorry. Yes, madam. There's a mic making its way.
Thank you. Councillor Connie Nolan, I'm also a trustee of Canterbury for Ukraine, so I was very interested what you said earlier as well, John. How can you reassure the Ukrainians in the UK that Britain isn't going to flip-flop? That's their great worry.
Well, Karen, I'd be concerned and a bit upset if they felt that there was a sense that the UK was going cool on Ukraine. I think one of the great strengths has been that the UK has been united for Ukraine from day one. I'm proud that our party, as the Labour Party, stood with Kyiv from day one. And in fact, when David Lammy and I were in Kyiv 5 weeks before Putin invaded, talking to the Ukrainians then, we said, look, if Putin does invade, we can guarantee you that the UK will be united, and that remains. And it is one of the strengths that allows us, I think, to lead and influence other nations, that we don't have that division of opinion that doesn't recognise that, frankly, the defence of Europe, the defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. They're fighting for their freedom, but they're also fighting for our future as well. And I think we don't do enough, first of all, to help the public, remind the public, understand that, And secondly, we don't do enough either to recognise the way that ordinary Britons opened their homes to Ukrainian refugees more than 2.5 years ago, and many are still really still in their homes as part of their families. And I think we should do more to recognise that as well.
So are you committed to an internal UK at the period of PR about what we're actually doing? Now we're a new Labour government.
So part of the responsibility that I think political leaders have is to do exactly that. To lead, to try and help lead and contribute to a public debate, and to try and do more to explain why we make decisions, not just what the decisions are that we're making.
One last question from the back then.
Probably do it without a microphone, but hi. Simon Cassidy, South East Cornwall CLP. Something you just touched on there, and firstly, congratulations on your appointment. Something you touched on there is the amazing work people across the United Kingdom are doing to support Ukraine, and it often goes unnoticed. 2 years ago, the Conservative government released a humanitarian medal, which was available for people who were supporting places like Ukraine, places like Gaza and the like. However, the criteria of that medal states you must either be working for UK government or be a UK government employee.
Okay.
Can you please get the government to look at this criteria? There are thousands of people across the UK spending thousands of pounds of their own money to support our amazing friends in Ukraine and getting zero recognition for it. And at the same time, we need to highlight to the British people in the world how amazing the British public are at supporting Ukraine. We will always stand alongside Ukraine. Slava Ukraine.
Simon, can I get the government to have a look at it? Well, we are the government now, so the answer is yes. Secondly, actually, that had entirely passed me by. So if it's a recognition, or was designed to be some sort of recognition for what ordinary Britons are doing to support Ukraine, then the government up to this point has not done a very good job of promoting it.
John,
Just make sure I got your contact details afterwards, will you? Thank you.
thank you so much for a very, very candid and plain-spoken session. We very much appreciate it, and we very much appreciate you engaging with Policy Exchange in a bipartisan conversation about national security. I hope you'll all join me in thanking John very much for it.
Thank you all.